You're listening to The Back 40, the podcast for Ontario farmers, covering topics and issues that matter most to Ontario agriculture. Brought to you by Trillium Mutual Insurance, bringing the ag community together one podcast at a time. I'm the host of The Back 40, Mike Bryan, agribusiness specialist at Trillium Mutual Insurance. There always seems to be a lot of talk about food insecurity and not having enough food to feed our planet. And those of us in the agricultural industry have known for a lot of years that we do have lots of food. It's a question of getting it where it needs to go. But that, of course, always has been a challenge. Now, one of the things that, as far as a solution goes, we're told that by 2050, we may need to double the food production on this planet in order to feed everyone. But there's other options to that as well. One of the things you have to consider is that we waste a tremendous amount of food on this planet that never is eaten. It's produced, but never gets to where it can be consumed. Or if it does, it gets thrown out after it's there. We're talking today with Denise Philippe, Senior Policy Advisor with the National Zero Waste Council and with Metro Vancouver. Denise, welcome to the Back 40.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
So for our listeners that don't know who Denise Philippe is, please introduce yourself.
I'm a Senior Policy Advisor with the National Zero Waste Council and Metro Vancouver. For those of you who are not familiar potentially with either of those, the National Zero Waste Council is a national waste prevention initiative that has come from Metro Vancouver, a regional level of government. As a regional level of government, about a decade ago, we were in the process of updating a number of our management plans, including our solid waste management plan. And we set ambitious targets around how we were going to prevent and drive down solid waste. Organic was a major part, continues to be a major part of the waste stream. And we set some ambitious targets around reducing that type of waste as well. And in the process of doing that, we realized that we were not going to be able to meet those ambitious targets unless we worked collaboratively beyond our region. And we needed to work with both business as well as different levels of government, different types of businesses, as well as community organizations, etc. That was the birth, really, of the National Zero Waste Council. So the council was created as a platform that enabled collaboration between different sectors, public, private, not-for-profit, as well as an opportunity to address a variety of waste streams. Food loss and waste is one of them. So that's a little bit of background on both the council and Metro Vancouver. The council really does the work it does by focusing on design change, behavior change throughout supply chains, and we do a little bit of advocacy as well.
So how far does your mandate extend now? It's more than just the greater Vancouver area, isn't it?
So we work across Canada, and a lot of our work does look internationally to take best practices and knowledge from around the world, as well as doing our own sort of, I would call it homegrown kind of knowledge building and knowledge sharing work to ensure that Canadians across the country have an opportunity to engage with and better understand how do we drive down waste. And today we're talking about food loss and waste, and there's a very large Canadian conversation happening around food loss and waste.
I think we all realize that there's a fair amount of food that gets thrown out, but I wonder if people are aware of just how big that problem actually is. How much of the food that we have produced in this country actually gets to be eaten by Canadians?
There are some disturbing numbers around our food loss and waste, and I think for farmers, it might feel a little depressing at times. In Canada, we know that we have about $49 billion worth of food sent to landfill or being composted.
That's a lot of food.
$49 billion worth of food. We do know that globally about half of all of our food produced is not eaten. And so I'm using a global figure because I know that a lot of farmers are also exporting internationally. So when we think about the amount of food that's produced and not consumed, we also need to think about all the resources that go into growing and producing that food, processing and distributing that food. So yes, the numbers are big. If we consider things like the water, power, the labor that goes into production, food production, processing and distribution, we're probably looking at around $100 billion worth.
Now, I know a lot of farmers are going to say, like, I can't afford to get rid of that amount of food on my farm, and I'm not losing that amount of food on my farm. So, where's it disappearing out of the system? Where are the culprits and the points at which we lose food out of the system?
For farmers who are listening right now, I think I do want to say that the council typically works really from the farm gate forward. We're not really looking at a lot of food loss and waste at the farm level because we know that bumper crops of tomatoes that don't get to market can be plowed under, and those nutrients go back into soil. So we do find that the biggest chunk really is at the point of manufacturing and processing combined. That's about 43% of food that's lost.
You make a distinction between those two. What's the difference between manufacturing and processing?
Processing would be things like milk, dairy farms that are then pasteurizing milk. Milk is then being turned into yogurt, etc. Manufacturing food might be different types of food products. We typically do wrap together manufacturing and processing, so that together that's about 43%. We find that consumers waste about 21%, and that's sort of waste that happens within a household.
So something like a head of lettuce that doesn't get eaten and ends up getting thrown out because it goes bad. We bought too much of it.
Exactly. Yeah. And for processing and manufacturing, those are things like it's the way we cut and trim our food that's creating more waste than necessary. It's sometimes considering an organic product that comes into a plant, but we're only using a part of it because only part of it is actually considered food and the other parts of it are not considered food. This might be something like carrot, where a carrot comes into a retail store, it's sold as a carrot, but the leafy greens are always snapped off and people don't use the leafy greens. But those leafy greens are great for salads, soups, etc. And if we really thought about those leafy greens as our food, as a food item, we would not be wasting that or losing that. That would be one example. Another example I give, which would be more at the manufacturing processing point, I would say, is something like chicken feet. They're a delicacy or they're a straight up food item. In other contexts, they're not actually considered part of the chicken that we would consume. So, really rethinking what is a food item, what is not. And for people who have a little bit of a historical pulse on this, I always give the example of cheese curds. Previously, we never used them. There was no market for them until, and I'm being a little facetious here, maybe through the advancement of poutine. And all of a sudden we discovered that cheese curds actually have a market value. And now we would never think to lose the cheese curd, that it is actually a food item.
I always told my wife it's important that I eat poutine. Now I can say that there's a definite reason for that.
Exactly.
So this is a large problem that we have, the manufacturing. We also see this problem, though, showing up at the supermarket as far as food wastage goes. And you talked about losing the leafy greens off of the carrot as one of those examples. But there's also a fair amount of produce that finds its way out the back door into the dumpsters just simply because it gets past its best before date.
Yeah, and that would be things like milk. It would be things like hummus, for example. So we don't typically see loss of fresh produce in that way, but there are a lot of other food items that are processed and that end up for sale at a retail outlet that have a best before date stamped on it. Now, when I say retail stores, I'm not just talking about grocery stores. I'm also talking about your coffee shops. So you might find food items that come into coffee store that are repackaged as part of a lunch meal kit. So you have a boiled egg and you've got some veggies with dip and you've got crackers. Those items are also given best before dates, for example. The best before date, either at a grocery store or in those kinds of restaurant food service outlets, do cause a problem because we see a lot of wastage from food that is perfectly good to eat.
Yes, there's that misconception of that best before date. Some people think that means don't eat afterwards, but in many cases, that food is still quite good. Even after it's reached its best before date, it hasn't spoiled. There's nothing really wrong with it.
Yeah, so just to be clear, best before dates identify peak freshness, maybe peak taste. They are not a health and safety date. We only have a small number of food that needs an expiry date. The expiry date is a health and safety date. The problem with best before dates is a lack of understanding about what they mean. They are too often used to move goods in a retail setting. Anything that is past a best before date is often moved off shelf because the retailer knows that consumers don't want to buy them, but it's also a way for new food items to constantly flow through a store. And then who's applying those best before dates and what those best before dates are put on are both continue to be problems for us. We need more guidelines, a narrower window of who can apply them and on what type of food.
It's fair to say here that the problem lies both with the people that are selling it and the people that are buying it too. We don't want something
Yes.
that's past its best before date, and the store wants to make sure that they have constant supply of fresh looking produce because
Yes.
they want to be appearing to have something that's great in front of consumers.
This would be an example, I would say, of a food system issue. And I want to talk about food system issues a little bit because I know that a lot of farmers are listening to these podcasts. A lot of the food loss and waste challenges we find are not a challenge at only one point in a supply chain. They're system problems. So I want to talk about a few things. I think one of the problems that we have, particularly in Canada, is that we do not have a culture of food. We essentially pay too little.
I would think you'd get a lot of farmers that would agree with you on that.
Yeah, and I think as much as I work for the National Zero Waste Council, I grew up on a small hobby farm in the Fraser Valley. So I have a sense of what it means to grow up in a farming family. Our family didn't rely totally on our farm, but they significantly supplemented our day-to-day living. I think if we had a culture of food that where we could see true cost accounting for our food, where we recognized and then paid for all the inputs that go into food, and that includes a farmer's time, it includes laborers that are helping to harvest, it includes the soil, the water, all the things that we need to add to our soil to make sure that we can continue to produce over time, we would see actually our food prices rise considerably. The other thing I want to talk a little bit about is procurement. How we purchase our food from farmers and then get it to consumers is also a bit of an issue. Those procurement contracts are often between a retailer and a processor or a manufacturer, but it spills over to the farmer. Who's buying a farmer's product? How consistent? Where is the buffer when we have bad weather that doesn't cooperate with our crop? There are no buffers. And we are set out with pretty rigid procurement contracts. So if we're in the game and we want to buy 200 pounds of beef every month, well, that's what we're buying. Except that sometimes we have more than 200 pounds of beef to sell, or sometimes we have far less than 200 pounds of beef to sell. So how do we deal with those fluctuations? And I would say it's often the farmer that bears the brunt of that. The surplus buying, or a retailer will buy 200 pounds, can't move the 200 pounds. When we're tied to those procurement contracts, from a retail perspective, if you don't move it, it becomes food that is wasted. So then you, as a retailer, you're either donating it or you're trying to offload that surplus in other ways. Whereas if we had a system where we could respond to the conditions in which we are growing, processing, and selling our food a little bit more nimbly, we would have less waste. We would be able to match our farmers with our consumers for different points of the supply chain. We would know when we would need to use a food item up, or how to buy more of it, or how to buy less of it at any given time. So those procurement contracts are a challenge.
It makes a little bit of a problem in this country in particular because of our climate, where in my area in particular, we've got produce coming in May, June, July, August, September, October, maybe for some of the root vegetables, and then that's it. And stores say, but I want a supply of fresh lettuce all year, and I want a supply of potatoes all year, and I want a supply of corn all year. And we can't do that without getting into greenhouse operations in this country. And that you talked about those procurement, it makes it very hard for a local farmer to get one of those contracts if they say, well, yes, but I'll only have it for 3 months of the year.
Yeah, exactly. One of the other challenges, I think, in terms of food loss and waste is how our system, our food system, has become so global. On the one hand, if you're a farmer or processor, you want to take advantage of those global markets, and sometimes they pay better. At the same time, without having a direct local relationship in a full supply chain, we feel like we can't charge enough maybe for our food items. We feel tied to only producing certain types of crops at certain times of volume. So this kind of speaks to like, you want strawberries all year round sort of thing.
Right.
We need a more responsive food system. Localizing our food systems also means that people start to build a more direct connection to their food. They understand where it comes from, the energy and time and resources that go into producing it. So I think that that also builds an awareness around how important it is to not waste the food that we have, and hopefully build a commitment to use the whole food. So this kind of speaks to the sort of carrots and carrot tops and the chicken feet example. How do we really creatively rethink all parts of an item as being food? So that requires some creative thinking and some cross-cultural thinking, I would argue. And then it requires us to really rethink our processing and manufacturing. So I want to talk a little bit about spinach just briefly. If you're a spinach farmer, if you're working with a processor, a manufacturer, and a retailer that will say, we're going to purchase this whole crop from you, and it's not just going to be for salad. When it gets to the point of processing, the spinach that's great for salad is going to go for salads. The stuff that's not great for salad maybe can actually be processed and dried into spinach pucks that can be used for smoothies. So how do we take the process and manufacturing point of the supply chain and open up more market opportunities? And I think all of us in the supply chain need to work through that so that we're supporting each other and coming up with those other food types and creating markets for them to sell in.
Now, this is a solution that's not going to just be solved, though, by the supply chain. It also has to be some of the behavior of consumers as well. And as you mentioned, one of the problems there is, why would I buy a spinach puck in February when I can buy fresh spinach that's sitting right there on the shelf and it comes in from Mexico and it's cheap, and well, why do I care? But that contributes to this food loss if you can't find a place for those spinach pucks or whatever that product is that you're using there.
Yeah, so I think relocalizing our supply chains can help in that regard. We lose food when we transport food over large distances. We lose a lot of fresh produce if it comes from far away. It means that it has to sit in a refrigerated truck or a plane for a lot longer. What's the quality of that food that comes to our table? So yes, wanting mangoes all year round comes with a price, and sometimes the price is food waste. We
Yep.
lose it from the point of the farmer to the consumer.
Do you like what you're hearing from the Back 40? We'd like to hear from you. Send us an email with your comments and thoughts to theback40@trilliummutual.com or follow us on social media @trilliummutual. So, what does the National Zero Waste Council do in order to try and provide some solutions for these problems?
We do have something called a food loss and waste strategy for Canada. It's on our website, and it does try to make recommendations for change or best practices that can be picked up at different points in the supply chain, typically past the farm gate. However, I do reference in there whole crop purchasing, which would be a relationship with our farmer. True cost accounting for food continues to be important. And I know farmers are going to be all over that. General consumers, not so much, maybe. So this is where we need a bit of a culture shift around how do we value our food. Some of the work that we do is bringing together different stakeholders in the supply chain. So we bring together processors and retailers. We bring together different levels of government with business so that we can build knowledge together and share knowledge together and identify best practices. So the knowledge building happens also through collaborative research that we do. Some of the collaborative research that we recently finished, for example, was looking at the intersection of food loss and waste and packaging. There's been a big, recently acknowledged concern over plastics. It's important that we address our plastic obsession. I was concerned that if we weren't careful, however, that we might start moving in the direction of eliminating or banning all plastic, including plastic packaging. And some of that actually does a good job of extending our food shelf life. So we didn't want to make policy changes in one area that was going to result in a lot of problem in another. So we wanted to understand what was that intersection of food loss and waste and packaging. And what we found was that it is more important to reduce our food loss and waste, that has bigger climate impacts. That's really where we really do need to do really good work. At the same time, we have the tools at our disposal to reduce both food loss and waste and reduce packaging at the same time. So that's a knowledge building exercise, knowledge sharing. We do workshops and webinars and all kinds of things where people can come together to talk about. So how do we address best before date? How do we address extending the shelf life of food? How do we address reducing the amount of waste that happens when we distribute food? So this is like talking about more and larger cold storage available within urban centers. So it's not just cold storage in trucks, for example. We also work with consumers. So we have a Love Food, Hate Waste campaign, which helps them identify how they can make best use of all those pieces of a product that we normally check out. Broccoli stems are awesome, and we forget about them. We only want to use the flower part of the broccoli, but broccoli stalks or broccoli stems are great for soups, stir fries, etc. So those are the kinds of tips that we provide in that campaign.
What's being done elsewhere in the world? This isn't just a problem that only affects Canada. There's other jurisdictions around the world that have taken some steps to deal with the food wastage problem. And what have some other countries done?
A lot of the things that the council is doing and a lot of the things that you'll find in a food loss and waste strategy for Canada have basically been picked up from around the world. So a lot of that is not new. It's more like taking the best of that is happening around the world. So other countries, for example, Copenhagen has a best before date store. So anything that's not sold at the regular grocery store, the best before date is passed. It goes to a store and it's sold at a discounted price. Awesome. Why could we not do that here? If we're not going to change our best before dates, let's still find a way to use them. Hummus past its best before date, completely edible within reason, right?
If it's got green on top, it's probably got a problem.
It's probably gone. Yes, exactly,
yeah.
right? We all know the story of the milk that sits in our fridge. It's past its best before date. We give it a sniff. It's fine. We pour it on the cereal. It's fine, right? Denmark has some really great consumer facing campaigns around stopping food waste. So they're doing their consumer education bit. WRAP in the UK is doing enormous amounts of work with farmers, but really grocery retail and processors and manufacturers. And so things here would include changing the way we cut our green beans. Tesco was selling green beans that we would lose almost half the bean given how that green bean was cut. So now you can buy green beans at Tesco that are not cut at all. So you have to cut it off, but you have greater control as a consumer around how much of that bean you actually use. So that's a processing piece, but it's also how we present the food that we're selling in our grocery stores. A commitment to measuring and monitoring is also starting to grow in different countries. We need to measure what we're wasting, monitor how our changes that we're implementing are impacting that wastage over time, making sure that we drive down that waste successfully. So measuring and monitoring is happening. I'd say the UK is probably the best at it. I think WRAP is really supporting businesses and governments figure out how do they measure and monitor in a way that makes sense. Whole crop purchasing is also being done, I would say, in the UK. France is known for its ugly fruit campaigns, where it's encouraging people to buy fruit that doesn't fit that stereotypical, we only want the red, polished, shiny apple. It's like apples are great. A little bit of blight does not change the taste of an apple, for example. So we need to develop a love affair with our food that allows us to love all the food in all its shapes and sizes and its blemishes, right? As opposed to wanting something that feels too maybe a Hollywood product, I would say.
I grew up on a farm with a garden, and there was very little number one stuff that came out of that. A lot of stuff misshapen, a lot of stuff that had a blight or something on it there. And I was taught from a very early age that a sharp knife can change a lot of that stuff. You take that little piece that you don't want to eat out.
Yeah.
And away you go. And I know we didn't spray our apples, so there was a lot of blight and a few worms. And you
that
get a knife out, and that comes with the apple. The laugh was that the only thing worse than finding a worm in the apple is only finding half of it because you ate it.
That's right, exactly. And no one can tell me that those two-fingered carrots taste any different than the one-fingered carrot. Some of this is just craziness.
And my dad used to love if we could get a hold of new potatoes that were small, something that was less than an inch in diameter, and that was a delicacy. We certainly didn't throw those out.
No. So again, that would be a procurement requirement. Changing the expectations around what we want to see in the store is really, really important. And that's the other piece where I think it really does affect farmers in a really big way. The other part I would say, and I want to bring this up just because I think it does refer to farmers. I talk about it in a food loss and waste strategy. There are some good gleaning organizations that will work with farmers. And in fact, I took my family and we spent a week with a gleaner in the Okanagan. It was a gleaner that was doing the rounds with local farmers, picking up the food that they couldn't sell because of its shape, or it was starting to get a little bit too close to maybe just starting to rot, maybe, but we could cut away parts of it. That particular gleaner was drying those food items and then sending that dried food to communities that had trouble accessing food. Some of those communities were Canadian, often in the
Hmm.
north. Some of them were international. There are something like 6 large gleaning organizations across Canada, but they have yet to be joined up and to really build efficiencies. But I would encourage farmers to see, are there gleaning organizations in your community or that you can tap into? They're a really great way to work if you can't, if you're still, stuck with procurement guidelines that are not fitting your needs.
We sometimes forget, particularly where I live. I mean, I'm a 5-minute drive away from quite a few farmers markets in the summertime, and certainly in BC, where you're from, there's an easy drive to some places there where we produce the food. There's lots of places, even in Canada, that we don't produce food, that we have to transport it in, and we have to transport it quite a distance. And anything we can do with the food that it isn't going to make that trip, if we can find a way to process it to make it saleable in those areas, that's a win for the system.
Yes, and so that's another piece that maybe I'll just mention. We talk about food loss and waste. We're starting to talk more about circular food systems, which means that once you grow a product, you want to keep the nutrients and the resources that have gone into that product. You want to keep it in the system. You don't want it to end up in a landfill in any way, right? Where it's trapped. It
Yep.
doesn't, landfills don't create soil. They're just like big, ugly messes of stuff. It's an
Yeah.
anaerobic environment.
The best we
So
can
we
do
want
is make it into a ski hill.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So we don't want it to end up there. So here's the other piece for farmers. I think we talk about food loss and waste prevention. We are just starting to talk about circular food systems. And when we talk about a circular food system, it means that we want agriculture, we want regenerative agriculture, we want all the resources that go into creating a food product, whether that's, milk, beef, or apples or potatoes or whatever it is. And we want to keep it circulating. So it means it needs to get to people. And when they eat it, when they're finished with it, it goes to compost. The compost produces new soil, healthy soil that is used by farmers to grow more food. So that's the cycle that we want to keep alive. It helps if we can keep our systems circular and more local. When we lose a lot of the processing and manufacturing industry, or when we prevent farmers from actually doing processing on their own land, we create a system where big distances are required between every step of the supply chain. The longer and the bigger that supply chain, the more we lose every step of the way, right? It's going to, we're going to lose strawberries from the strawberry farm. We're going to lose tomatoes, but, grown at the farm, it goes to a plant to make into different tomato products. We're going to lose some along the way, and then we might lose some again between the farm and the retail store because they're going to get bruised along the way. So how do we shorten those supply chains? And I think in Canada, and I'm going to speak in a BC context here, we have lost a lot of our processing and
Yes.
manufacturing. Ontario has a lot, but here we do not. The more we can do to build that processing and manufacturing sector, keep it local, and even allow farmers to not have restrictions around agricultural lands, so that agricultural lands can be used as sites of processing as well. Sometimes those activities are kept quite distinct. You can grow food, but you can't have a plant or that would be considered an industrial use of that land. So sometimes we keep those two things quite separate. And sometimes for good reasons. We want our ag lands to be growing, producing stuff, but we don't always want to make it a site for processing. But sometimes those things can be married. And the more that we can marry them, the better, because it allows us to have really short distances between parts of the supply chain.
So we've talked a lot about our cost to the economy here and the $49 billion of food wastage that we lose, but there's a cost to the environment as well, isn't there? And that we need to solve both of those problems as we go forward, don't we?
Yes, 100%. And I'd say it's even our economy, it's our environment, and it's our society, and certainly in a post-pandemic world and a world sort of fraught by climate change, both the environment and our society impacts are significant. When we lose food, we contribute to climate change. When we don't eat that food and it ends up in a landfill, it produces methane, which is a greenhouse gas. We don't want it to do that. We want to grow food. The food that's not waste, we want to be able to turn into healthy soil that we reuse again, so we keep that carbon circulating. We're seeing quite significant greenhouse gas contributions from food that is lost and wasted, that is not captured back into soil. So that's one piece. And then I'd say from a societal perspective, the more disconnected we are from our food, the more we waste it. When we waste food and we have food insecure communities at the same time, it feels at some level criminal, actually, at best negligent. How is it that we can lose food and still have people that don't have regular access to it? That's a conundrum that I think we really need to solve.
And I think that for those of us that have grown a garden or worked in a garden, and the amount of work that it takes to grow that food, especially if you're doing physically, boy, you don't want to waste any of that. I washed a lot of potatoes and carried them downstairs, and you certainly didn't want those to be spoiled, because then you had to carry them back out in the spring. And yes, they would be composted and used again, but you still lost all that effort that you put into that. And you talk about the methane. I mean, we think of the emissions that it takes to grow the crop, the tractors, the produce, or the tractors, the distribution, the trucks, and all of that. But that's another form of environmental problem that we create if we don't actually eat that food.
Absolutely. I would like to see a world where our farmers are paid, where farm laborers are earning a decent wage, and they're paid because we as a society really value the food that we eat and the people that are producing it for us.
I think that's something that we could discuss that. There's a lot of different implications to that as well. We have been talking with Denise Philippe of the National Zero Waste Council and Metro Vancouver about food wastage in Canada. Join us next time when our guest will be Chantal Lewington from the Northeastern Online Farmers Market and ClickFork, and we'll be talking about their unique solutions to taking farmers markets online. Denise, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mike. Take care.
You've been listening to The Back 40, brought to you by Trillium Mutual Insurance. Be sure to subscribe to The Back 40 wherever you find your favorite podcasts so that you don't miss an episode. The Back 40, bringing the ag community together one podcast at a time. I'm Mike Brine. Until next time, take care and stay safe.